Welcome to Small Talk with the Lees. My name is Brandon, and I'm joined by co-hosts Justin and guests Alejandro and Andre. We're discussing the CES letter, an examination into the truth claims of the LDS Church. This is part 5, and this is also the second part of a segment that we're doing on the Book of Abraham. If you haven't listened to the last episode, go ahead and check it out. It's talking about the textual problems of the Book of Abraham, and that's where we kind of introduce the issues and problems with the Book of Abraham. This episode is going to focus on the translation issues of the Book of Abraham, and we go really deep into the weeds here. So try not to get lost. I think I do my best I can in explaining and summarizing the arguments that are made against the Book of Abraham, as well as the apologetic responses and Dan Vogel's responses to them. In the next episode, we're going to discuss the implications of the textual and translation problems of the Book of Abraham. How are we to interpret what he's doing as he's translating the papyri? And are we to classify his work as a fraud? Stay tuned. Keep your hands in and your legs in the ride at all times. Keep that buckle on, and we're just going to dive straight into the weeds of the Book of Abraham.
The fortune's lost. There's a voice that's buried deep inside my head. As it stumbled out, it said, hey, I got another chance. I was living like a zombie, head in a trance. Hey, and we're slow, and life is all you know. And when it flashed before my eyes, I realized this is everything.
All right, so we are going to dive into the translation issues of the Book of Abraham, and this is kind of what the CES letter just starts to dive into. So I want to start this off with this Facebook statement, because I think this is going to present the clearest kind of view of what we're talking about, because I think a question that's going to be going on people's head is, how does the church kind of deal with these kind of arguments? What's the official response? And even though we don't have an official response from the church per se, but I can give you quotes from Oakes and Holland in interview. But I'm going to give you this quote from Brian Hauglid. I mentioned, not in this podcast, but I mentioned earlier that there are very few people willing to defend the historicity and the literal translation of the Book of Abraham. And those people are pretty much limited to the FAIRS people, which is the Foundation for, I think, Apologetic Research. I don't have the full name on that, but it's the apologetic arm of the church. And these people are basically people like Daniel Peterson, John Gee, and I think his name is Jerry Muhlestein. And Gee and Muhlestein are Egyptologists, Yale, and I think they're both Yale PhDs. If not Yale, then a very good school similar to Yale. And Brian Hauglid and Gee worked on a lot of the Book of Abraham scholarship in the last 2 decades. Now, the reason why I think you should take Brian Hauglid seriously is because the official Gospel Topics essay on the Book of Abraham actually cites him 7 times of I don't remember how, I think there's, let me check, 46 footnotes. Hauglid is found in 7 of the 46 footnotes on the church's Gospel Topics essay that you can still go to today. So this is a scholar that the church is using to defend the arguments presented in their Gospel Topics essay. So when a scholar changes their mind on this, a scholar from not a non-LDS scholar like Dan Vogel, right? This is one of the go-to guys of the 3. That's important. And I say this because people will dismiss Brian Hauglid by saying, well, he's not an Egyptologist. But the problem I have with that is Brian Hauglid has been involved with all the Egyptology work in the Book of Abraham for the last 2 decades for the church. and he's currently working on the Joseph Smith Papers edition. So here's the quote that he wrote on Facebook. If you want to see it, you can go to Prove All Things Hold Fast to Good and search Book of Abraham, Brian Hauglid. He says, and this is in response to Dan Vogel's 8-part series. He dives deep into the Book of Abraham translation issues, and he's attacking the apologists, including Brian Hauglid. And Brian Hauglid, in response on Dan Vogel's Facebook page, says this, quote, "For the record, I no longer hold the views that have been quoted from my 2010 book in these videos. I have moved on from my days as an scare quotes, outrageous apologist. In fact, I'm no longer interested or involved in apologetics in any way. I wholeheartedly agree with Dan's excellent assessment." That's Dan Vogel, the guy criticizing the other apologists, "with Dan's excellent assessment of the Abraham Egyptian documents in these videos. I now reject a missing Abraham manuscript. I agree that 2 of the Abraham manuscripts were simultaneously dictated. I agree that the Egyptian papers were used to produce the Book of Abraham. I agree that only Abraham 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verse 18, were produced in 1835, and that Abraham chapter 2, verse 19 through chapter 5, verse 21 were produced in Nauvoo." Now, as you're listening to this, none of this might make any sense probably, but I'm using this as background because I'm going to dive into all of the issues that he talks about here in detail. So just keep that in mind, that Hauglid used to deny all of these theories, and now he is saying that he accepts them. And then so it goes on. He says, and on and on. That's his word. So he's saying all of the other theories that Dan Vogel presents. Now he continues and says, "I no longer agree with Guy or Muhlestein." Those are his 2 counterparts, right? "I find their apologetic, scare quotes, scholarship on the Book of Abraham abhorrent." So he uses the word abhorrent, and he's demoting their scholarship in scare quotes. Then he says, "One can find that I've changed my mind in my recent and forthcoming publications. The most recent, Joseph Smith Papers, Revelations and Translation, Volume 4, the Book of Abraham and related manuscripts, now on the shelves, is much more open to Dan's thinking on the origin of the Book of Abraham. My friend Brent Metcalf can attest to my transformative journey." And then Dan Dan decides to post Brian Hauglid's comments on all of his YouTube pages, on all of his 8-part series, to honor Brian Hauglid as shifting his opinion. And David Bokovoy says this: "Brian is a true scholar, one who constantly shifts his view to match the best available evidence. He is also one of the best humans on the face of the planet." Just had to add that. So I present this as kind of a confirmation from one of the top scholars.
Yeah, and I think people in response to that said he never gave any argument, like critically rebutting John Gee and Muhlestein's points. He's just saying it's abhorrent. So I could see on the other side, if they would want an actual argument by argument why he thinks it's abhorrent instead of just dismissing it. I think it is significant, though, to your point, that one of the main scholars that is an apologetic suddenly turns like 180 and has a different view. But I think on the other side, it's not as satisfactory, and it seems more of just there's no argument presented. He's just saying he doesn't agree with it.
So I agree that it is the fault of faith always lies in trusting in flesh, right? So even let's say people maybe even antagonistic to the Book of Abraham, or to the church, let's say. I don't think you can be antagonistic to the Book of Abraham, but people antagonistic to Mormonism, let's say, even that, for them to rely on any single person, I think is a flaw, because that's what we see with faithful members relying on John Gee's work. So I do want to kind of hedge that in that way. But I would have to say, to Brian Hauglid's credit, people ask him on the Facebook thread and they say, "Hey, I'm curious as to, oh, snap, care to elaborate on the abhorrence, And he says, hey, Brian comments and says, "Dan does a good job in these videos showing where there's abhorrence in my view." So Brian is basically pointing to the 8-part series that Dan Vogel does, debunking kind of the arguments that the apologists present. And I think he is in complete agreement with basically everything Dan Vogel said there. That's what it seems to me.
Yeah. And fair enough. I mean, perhaps, because it seems like John Gee and Muhlestein, the Egyptologists, are in the very, very fringe minority of what they actually do believe. And so some of that is based on the perspective that they want to maintain this faithful, quotes, view. I'm not saying that they're not faithful, but faithful view, and then they're going to kind of make conclusions based on that faithful perspective. And I think for
Yeah,
them,
and
that
that's
faithful
actually
perspective is very literal.
exactly. Muhlestein was actually the one who said this at a fair conference before he presented. He said, any new data we find, we immediately fit it into our
Their
faithful
worldview.
perspective.
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
and Guy absolutely shares the same view.
Yeah. So I mean,
But there's a problem here, and I kind of agree with, in the David Bokovoy interview on Mormon Stories, he says, look, I'm fine if you want to go with the Gospel Topics essay, and it says, in the end, none of this matters because it all just comes down to revelation and the value and the spirit that you feel while reading these texts. And he says, if you want to go that way, fine. Like, that's totally cool. And then he says, if you want
don't
to go the
pretend to be
opposite way,
doing scholarship.
but he said, yeah, you can't mix the two and pretend, if all of that doesn't matter, then why spend your entire life going to Yale, getting a PhD, and writing decades and decades of work? And, I don't necessarily agree with David Bokovoy on that, because I like how at least someone tries to consider the scientific view. What I do agree with him on is, as I watched the Dan Vogel videos, and I didn't watch all of them because they were very boring, but that's because he tries to maintain as neutral a tone as possible when he's arguing, is that he really makes it hard to like Muhlestein and Guy because of the manipulative practices that they use in their scholarship, by ignoring evidence, by presenting evidence in a completely different way, the spins that they take on it over and over. That is what I find troubling.
Was Dan Vogel, is he an Egyptologist as well? I know he's
Dan
the one
Vogel
that
is not. He's just a
excommunicated
historian.
and a scholar. Okay.
He's a historian, but he's taken seriously because of the works that he's produced. He's not antagonistic. Actually, I was telling Andre this earlier, and we can talk about this in the second half, but Dan Vogel's thinking is that the Book of Abraham, he calls it a pious fraud. And by using the word pious, he immediately pisses off all the anti-Mormons. But when he uses the word fraud, he pisses off all the Mormons. So he's not somebody that is like clear cut, it's like it's either this or that. He's also open to debate. If you go to these blogs and you search Book of Abraham debates and stuff, you'll see him comment with people, and he will not stop responding. He'll go to the end of the discussion because he's sincere in changing his mind about things, and he actually does change his mind in one of those blogs. Unfortunately, the thing that he changed his mind on actually was something he didn't know, and ended up strengthening his argument more. But this is a sidetrack, sorry. All I'm trying to say is Dan Vogel is taken seriously as a scholar, and he doesn't have as clear of an agenda as, let's say, maybe a Fawn Brody, perhaps.
Yeah. I'm curious Andre, do you have any thoughts on what's been said so far?
I honestly, I think it's interesting that that Hauglid changed his mind, and I think that's really important. That's something to take into consideration, because they're talking about the way that it was translated, and how I thought it was really interesting that Dan Vogel does give a lot of evidence. He goes really in depth. He gives a lot of evidence for it being translated at the same time, and I think that we need to take, I think it was Brother Arlington. He said, "There are no skeletons in our closet." I feel like if you put your faith first, and you should just be open to how things were, and you shouldn't try to mend the story so that it fits the narrative. I think that it tells its own narrative, and we know that people are people, and there is still a God, and so I feel like if there is this idea that apologetics is just a way of fitting the history to fit your own narrative, I think that should be done away with, because I think that truth is truth, and it'll set you free. I don't think that there's a reason to cover anything up or to hide anything, even though sometimes it is embarrassing, right? There's probably things about my history I wouldn't like revealed and things like that, but it happened, and that's how it is. So
So that
That's
is
my perspective on it.
really beautiful. I really appreciate what you just said there, Andre. I think what you're calling here is, or what you're talking about here, is actually called new apologetics or neo-apologetics. And we see people, and I like these people like Patrick Mason, um, and Terrell Givens, even, let's say, they don't pretend that there's a easy solution or even a solution to this Book of Abraham stuff. They really, I wrote in this blog article that you really like. If you're listening to this podcast and you haven't read, I highly recommend you read my Medium post called "Why the CES Letter." I just describe, I quote Joseph Smith in it, and I talk about how we take truth from wherever it may come. And so this changing perspective that Brian Hauglid holds, I see that as someone willing to follow the truth, someone that has honor in them. And I say that trying to, put down John Gee and Muhlestein as little as possible, because that's not my objective. But what I see in Brian is something really respectable and a sign of not only like good scholarship, but just that is an honorable character to have, I think. And it might help to everyone that is having trouble maybe processing all these problems as we read about the Book of Abraham stuff. Just kind of keep that in mind. It's like, if it's truth, it's truth, and then let's deal with it after that.
Yeah, I think it's important to, Professor John Gee teaches at BYU. One day you might take a class from him, he might fail you because he listens to your podcast. So you don't want to say anything bad about him.
John Gee, if you're listening, I appreciate what you're doing, but I probably won't take your class. Okay, so now that we've kind of got an overview, the concession of Brian Hauglid, let's say, none of that probably made sense to anyone. So let's just dive into what issues is he talking about. What is he talking about simultaneous dictation? What is he talking about Abraham 1 to 2 to 5? Like what is it was translated at different years? Or so we're going to cover all of that right now. Okay. And then after that, we're going to jump into the portion, how do we deal with all this? So translation problems of the Book of Abraham. I'm going to start with a question, because I have not found satisfactory resources to dive into these issues. Everything, once you jump in, it's like, just think of it like a plain of swamps, and there's just swamps everywhere. And like, you can jump into any of the swamps you want and you'll just get submerged you'll get lost in it. Okay. And what I want to do here is kind of allow you to traverse the terrain and just kind of dip your toe into each swamp, because I don't claim to be an expert of any of these rabbit holes or issues. I'm just going to present what I've found so far. So the first question you're going to have in your head is, okay, so these papyri that Joseph Smith have, what do they have to do with Abraham or Joseph? Because he claimed that there's the books of Abraham and the the Book of Abraham and the Book of Joseph located in them. As far as we can tell, there's absolutely no relationship. There are two main core scrolls. It might help to keep this picture in your head. What are the actual documents we have from Egypt? Okay, there are two main scrolls. One is called the Shenman scroll, and I'm probably not pronouncing that right. And the other is called the Horus scroll. Okay. Besides those two scrolls, we have some so within those two scrolls, actually, we have fragments, and the fragments are what we have today. The fragments are the Shenman part of the scroll and the Horus fragments of the Horus scroll. Now, the rest of the scrolls were indeed burned in the fire, in the Chicago fire, over 100 years ago. Besides those two scroll fragments, we have two loose fragments called the Book of it's a Book of the Dead from Neferrednerb, and we also have one or two other loose fragments, as well as Shashank's Hypocephalus. Okay, none of that's going to probably matter to you except for these two scrolls and the two fragments. The fragments that we have from the two scrolls remaining. Okay. So I need this picture in your head, right? Joseph Smith had a bunch of scrolls. Actually, he had 2 scrolls and a bunch of fragments. What we have today that you can go to the church archives and look at are 6 fragments from the Shenman scroll and 3 fragments from the Horus scroll. Okay, so this is going to be important when it comes to the argument about the missing scroll. So here's what we're going to dive into: these 2 scrolls. The Shenman scroll. The Shenman scroll is the Book of the Dead. In other words, they bury these with mummies in Egypt back in 100 BC is when this scroll dates to. So that's about 2,000 years after Abraham was alive. So that's a problem. But the Shenman scroll is,
but not necessarily. Can I just point out, even the Book of Mormon has things said about Lehi, but it's a compilation. So many times, people will write things as other people, So if I was writing a history of the United States of America, I might write from, George Washington's perspective, but I've written it today. Does that make sense? So not necessarily is that a problem, but yes.
Yeah,
that is true. That it's
right. And
1,000 years.
Thanks for bringing that up. So that's kind of the apologetic response to this would be, well, it might not be what Joseph Smith said, which is Abraham's own handwriting written upon the papyrus, but the people trying to argue for a literal translation of the Book of Abraham, they're going to argue that it was a copy of a copy.
Right. The dating is not Abraham's time. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's an argument you can make, is that Abraham's actual story was passed on for many years. Okay. I guess the problem that I find with that is that the Shenman scroll is a Book of the Dead, which in Egypt they bury it with mummies in order to help you navigate the next life. So it would be questionable to think that either the Book of Abraham or the Book of Joseph is appended onto this scroll somehow. And apologists actually don't even address the question of where is the Book of Joseph that Joseph mentioned, because it wasn't translated. But it seems like they would have to say that it's appended to the Shenman scroll. And that's problematic to me because it seems highly unlikely. But you can't it's not impossible, I guess. That's what I have to say. It's not an impossible.
I really wish that maybe the prophet Joseph would have written a little bit more about his translating, but how he did it.
Yeah, the process. And it's curious because he didn't even finish the Book of Abraham technically. We definitely know he had more to translate, right? He had more to produce, however you want to see it, right? So it would, I'm not even going to go into that, but lost scripture, ancient scripture, like everybody wants more if they could. So that's the Shenman scroll, right? The Horus scroll is the bulk of what we're going to focus on. So we're actually going to forget about the Shenman scroll and the Book of Joseph, because the Horus scroll is what we're going to link Abraham to. So, but the problem is the Horus scroll, what is it? It's a book of breathings, or a breathing permit, which basically means they bury it with dead people in Egypt. And this one's dated to 150 BC, also, around the same time, 2,000 years after Abraham. And what this is when the person comes to the afterlife, they need to be able to breathe, right? So you give this scroll, and they're in the tomb, right, in their coffin. They have their arms crossed, and they put the scroll like right above their hands or something like that. And it's to help them breathe in the next life. So that's what it is. So once again, I find it problematic to think that there is a Book of Abraham, because first of all, it's not in the portions that we have currently. And so the argument that is going to be made that we'll discuss is that, well, the Book of Abraham was appended somewhere else. Okay. So, but before I get into that, we need to have a visualization of what these scrolls are. So just think of a long rolled out piece of paper, and you read Egyptian from right to left. Okay. So it's backwards from English. It's like Chinese, I think. You're reading from right to left. Is that right, Justin? Chinese.
Yep. Well, yeah, but not now. I think most people will read from left to right, but yeah, for the most
ancient
part.
Documents. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is one thing Joseph got right. Right. He's reading it from right to left. So So the problem. Okay, so because we know that a lot of the scroll was burnt in the Chicago fire over 100 years ago, including parts of the Horus Scroll, we have to ask, is there any way that we know what's missing from this Horus Scroll? And here's some clues that we do have. It's most likely the case that facsimile 3 is at the very end of it. In other words, it's on the far left. Okay. Now, apologists are going to argue that that's not the end of the scroll. So I'll just throw that out there. Okay. But it's most likely that facsimile 3 is at the left side. Facsimile 3 is probably around 16 centimeters long. So the other question is, how long is this scroll in total then? And it's estimated to be about 56 centimeters. It's estimated to be somewhere around 5 feet. Okay. Here's where I told you about those swamps, because you can dive into any of these swamps and you'll soon be reading thousands of pages of scholarship arguing how you calculate the size of the scroll through its winding circles and the math formulas you use. John Gee wants to argue that the scroll is probably 10 feet in length. Hugh Nibley mentioned a scroll that spans 2 rooms in the mansion house. The problem, to sum up the problem with these arguments is Hugh Nibley, first of all, heard this from a person who heard this from a person who heard this from Joseph F. Smith, who heard this from like his mom or something, okay? And there's little to no other evidence that shows anything that shows a gigantic winding scroll. The problem with John Gee's 10-foot one, I actually don't have a clear answer to that, because I know he has his own arguments for why it should be 10 feet. I would like it to be kept in mind that the only reason why you're going to argue that the scroll is more than 5 feet is because you have to find somewhere to put the Abraham text to make it so that Joseph Smith is translating literally. But I guess I'm not an expert on this. If you want to look at the arguments against that, then you should watch Dan Vogel's videos, the 8-part series on YouTube. Just keep in mind it's 8 hours long. Okay. So I mentioned the apologist argument. So basically, if there's no correlation between what we have right now in the Horus Scroll and the Book of Abraham that we have, the question then becomes, how does John Gee and Muhlestein argue their position that Joseph Smith was indeed translating a literal document from Egyptian to English accurately? And so there's basically 2 main options that they use. The first option is a third scroll theory, and the second option is a long scroll theory. The third scroll theory says that, hey, we didn't just have 2 scrolls, right? The Horus Scroll and the Shenmin Scroll. There's some third scroll out there. We don't have it. Maybe it was burned. And in that scroll, it has the entire text of Abraham in Egyptian. Okay. So here's where I would say is the main problem with this theory. And all we have to do is actually open up the actual text of the Book of Abraham. So if you turn to Abraham chapter 1, verse 12 and verse 14, it presents a significant problem to the missing scroll theory. And actually, do you guys have that pulled open? My voice is getting tired. If you want to read it.
Where was it again?
Abraham chapter 1, verse 12 and verse 14.
Chapter 1, verse... I feel like I'm in Sunday school.
I was just surprised that I had to actually pull open my scriptures and study them when I was researching them.
Let me see here. So it's Abraham 1. I'm just going to pull it up. And then verse 4. Verse what again?
Verse 12 and verse 14.
Okay, so it says, and it came to pass that the priests laid violence upon me, that they might slay me also, as they did those virgins upon this altar. And that you may have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record. And 14, that you may have an understanding of these gods, I have given you the fashion of them in the figures at the beginning, which manner of the figures is called by the Chaldeans Ralinos, which signifies hieroglyphics.
So I want you to focus on 2 very important words here. in verse 12, it uses the word commencement. And in verse 14,
Yeah.
it uses the word beginning. Okay. Remember, we're reading from right to left. Oh, sorry, the police is after us. Remember, we're reading these scrolls from right to left. So when it says commencement, which means beginning, and when it says beginning, which means the start, we're talking about the right side of the scroll. In the text of Abraham itself, it's referring to an altar with Abraham being laid on it, and it's also referring to the gods. And we know both of these are facsimile 1, which is in your Pearl of Great Price. If you open up facsimile 1, it has a picture of Abraham on the altar. There's like the 4 jars, which are actually like jars where they're gut out your organs and put them in. But Joseph Smith interprets them incorrectly, according to modern Egyptology, to be Egyptian gods. So in the text itself, it's referring to facsimile 1 at the beginning of the record. So to argue that there's a missing scroll is extremely odd. I guess the only way to account for that would be a reprint of facsimile 1 on the missing scroll. I've never heard them argue that, but that's the only way I could conceive that even being possible. But it's just so highly unlikely because what we have left.
But don't they say that the text can be separate from the facsimile?
So they talk about the text being separate from the facsimile. Yes, that is correct. That's actually what the Gospel Topics essay says. So once again, it's like, okay, that's probably the argument that would be made by the apologists.
And I've also heard that the facsimile, it looks like it's been cut. I've heard that as well. So I'm not sure what to think on that.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one specifically. You're saying, so I guess the cut would have to be on the right side if that was the case. Yeah, okay, sure. We'll throw those out there. So I think we've been critical enough, so we can just leave those as 2 arguments maybe an apologist could make. I just find them, it just happens we have this portion extant from the fire. It shows up. No one knew it was still existing until 1966. It shows up. Church publishes it in 1967, and it happens, to match what we have facsimile 1 and the actual text of Abraham. So to me, that's how I'm going to calculate it. But
that makes sense. Yeah, you're taking a very that's logical. That makes sense.
Okay. The next part is, as far as the missing scroll goes, here's a quote that you might doubt where I said, okay, there's 2 scrolls, a bunch of fragments, the hypocephalus. Here's where we get that from, and it's not just the only quote. There's actually 2 main quotes, but I'll read this one. It's Oliver Cowdery to W.M. Fry on December 27th, 1835. Okay, so this is early on. It says, in connection with 2 of the 4 mummies were 2 rolls of papyrus, previously mentioned. I may add that 2 or 3 other small pieces of papyrus with astronomical calculations, epitaphs, etc., were found with others of the mummies. So this is where we get that there are indeed only 2 scrolls. So, it's totally possible that there is a 3rd scroll. It's not like impossible, I guess, but there's just no quotes that are solid evidence. And there's no like data points that really kind of support that theory. So once again, you're only going to make this 3rd scroll theory in order to support Guy's and Muhlestein's view that it's a literal translation. So I just see little to no evidence for it. The long scroll theory. Okay, here's one that is maybe a better argument.
The Gale?
Yes, so the Gale is going to come in very important with the long scroll theory. So basically to review this, it's the theory that at the end of the scroll, right, on the left side, you have more to the scroll than just the 5 feet. You might ask, okay, between facsimile 3 and the portions that we have right now, like what about that part in between though, right? The 3rd foot and the 4th foot. At most, there's probably like 2 columns, maybe 4 columns of text there. And it just, John Guy, doesn't even try to argue that the Book of Abraham's right there. It would just be way too small, I guess. So I'm not even going to address that. What John Guy and Muhlestein do try to argue is that it's further down the scroll than facsimile 3. Facsimile 3 is not the end of the scroll. So here's where Gel comes into play. Gel is, once again, that's the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. And so you have to have a picture in your head of kind of what other documents there are, right? So we have all the scrolls and the fragments, but at the same time, today you can go to the LDS archives and you can look and you'll find the GAEL, Gel, or you could go on Joseph Smith papers. But basically what it is it's part of the Kirtland Egyptian papers, which Joseph Smith wrote, Joseph Smith dictated while he was in Kirtland in 1835. Okay, so maybe a timeline on this will help. So in 1835, July, Joseph Smith purchases the mummies. He didn't want the mummies, he wanted the scrolls, but they wouldn't come separate. And he paid $2,400. Today, that's about $76,000 for us. That is a lot of money. So this is going to come down later when it comes to determining, was Joseph Smith intending to deceive or not, and was he a fraud or not? I think this is an important data point that he's willing to spend $76,000 to make his translation. When with the Book of Moses that he produces, he just sees the scroll in vision. He doesn't even have the scroll, right? So that's an interesting point. Okay. But in July, so July is when he purchases the scrolls. And July is also when he begins translating the first 3 verses of the Book of Abraham that we have in our Pearl of Great Price today, the first 3 verses. July is also the same time that he starts writing the 5 degrees of the grammar. Sorry, not the 5 degrees, is when he starts writing the alphabet of the Egyptian language, which is part of the GAEL, right? The GEL. So here's the timeline. Okay, July, he gets the scrolls. July, he starts translating the first 3 verses. July, he starts the grammar and alphabet. Now, from July to November of the same year, he is working on the grammar and alphabet through his scribes. So July to November, he produces Gel. Now, in November is when he actually begins, he resumes his translation from verse 4, starting from verse 4. And that is actually super important to know this timeline. And because the only thing you can do now is argue with that timeline in order to defend Guy and Muhlestein's theory. Because their theory is this, that the Gel, okay, I guess I didn't even describe the Gel. So here's the problem with the Gel being written from July to November and written before the Book of Abraham was translated. And the problem is this. The Gel, imagine a piece of paper and there's a line down the left-hand side. So on the left column, you write an Egyptian character. It's actual Egyptian for the most part. And on the right side, you have a whole paragraph of English words. This is the translation, the definition, the description, whatever you want to call it. Okay. And you have I can't remember how many, I think it's 20-something character groupings. So it's a lot. And you have basically that many explanations on the right-hand side. And so the problem with the Gel is what it shows is, first of all, the Gel is connected to the portion of the Book of Abraham scrolls, the Horus scroll that we have today. In other words, if you start on the right-hand side of the Horus scroll and you skip facsimile 1, you go to the Egyptian characters, you take the first character and you can find it listed as the first character on Gel. You take the second character reading right to left, and you see it as the second character on Gel, right? So that is a problem, right? Because it means that Joseph is in some way using the portion of the Horus scroll, the 5 feet that we know of today. Okay. So, of course, an apologetic argument would have to make it so that either the Gel was a reverse engineer of Joseph Smith's Abraham translation. So Joseph Smith translated it, and then the scribes tried to reverse engineer Egyptian translation, or you would have.
Yeah. So sorry. Let me just expand on that
Sure.
so people understand. So, for example, let's say that I am reading a page in in Spanish and I receive it through revelation, and then you go back through what I dictated and you match the words with what I just told you in the revelation. So trying to reverse it from the revelation to what it actually means. And so kind of like a Rosetta Stone is kind of what they're trying to do as well, right?
Yes, exactly. And so that's a cool point you bring up the Rosetta Stone, because before the Rosetta Stone was cracked, tons of people made up just absolute nonsense translations of Egyptian. And that is what the scholars really are trying to say here, is that, hey, Joseph Smith didn't produce the grammar and alphabet of Egyptian language. And they're actually correct in the sense that Joseph Smith dictated it to scribes, probably. So the scribes' handwriting, that's how we know it was scribes that wrote it, is because we look at their handwriting. He's saying, the apologists are trying to say, hey, the Gel, we agree, is nonsense. None of this actually is Egyptian to English translation. It doesn't make sense. But one of the arguments they're going to make is that, well, it was just the scribes, Phelps and I think Frederick G. Williams. They're just, they were just wrong, plain old wrong. They're trying to reverse engineer it, and they did it wrong. So that's what they're going to argue here. Another argument they're going, so here's the problem with that argument, right? It's not a reverse engineer if you agree with the timeline that Gale was produced from July to November, and then from verse 4 of chapter 1 to chapter 2, that didn't begin resuming translation till November. And I'll give you the evidence for that timeline. The evidence is going to be multiple entries in Joseph Smith's journal. And so that's how Dan Vogel gets that timeline. You can look up part 1 of Dan Vogel in the YouTube series. The next argument that's going to be made is, okay, well, let's say you're right on that, Dan. Well, then, I don't think it's actually a translation. They actually make this argument. To me, this one's just holds zero water. It's the Gale is not a translation. What you have is some English paragraphs, and then you have these characters on the left side to decorate the page. That's literally an argument that Guy makes. To me, that's just ridiculous. Because if you look at the Gale, you actually look at it, there's these abrupt breaks in the paragraph. There's some paragraphs that are only 5 words long, and they're always being matched with a character on the left side. And not only that, it says at the very top, this is penned in, I don't know who, Oliver Cowdery or whoever, it says translation at the top, and then on the left-hand side, it says character. Like, I just don't see where any of that would be going. So to me, that's one of the worst arguments that have ever been made. So I don't agree that Gale is simply a decorative exploration. Let's go to the next argument. They're going to say, let's see. So here's an argument that they're going to make, is that, remember when we read verses 12 through and 14, where it talks about the facsimile one being referenced in the book, which is the altar and the gods in the canopic jars. So looking back at the handwritten Gale, or actually at the handwritten manuscripts, they're going to say, hey, it looks like this handwriting is really cramped, at least in verse 12. And so it looks like this was added in later. Okay. So they're going to actually argue that the part that says, I will reference you to the commencement of this record, John Guy would claim that this is something that was added in later. That's probably the strongest argument that he can make, because it deals directly with the argument being presented. Here's the problem with that argument that Dan Vogel presents, is that he shows that, yes, there was probably a part added later, but that part probably started after the word commencement, I think. Or, after the word representation. So what was in the original dictation was, I will refer you to the representation. And then they added at the commencement of this record. Because if you think about the scribe sitting around the table with Joseph, and he's dictating the book of Abraham to them. And then he's like, hey, well, I'll show you like facsimile 1 that's sitting at your feet, right? And then they realize, wait, we can't write sitting at your feet. And they actually do this, and then they scribble it out. They don't use the word sitting at your feet, but I think Parrish writes that is laying before you, or something like that. And he scribbles it out because he realizes, well, anyone reading Abraham 1 later is not going to know what they're talking about, right? They have to change it to at the commencement of this record. So to sum it up, John Gee argues against verse 12 being used to support the fact that Abraham was translated from the scroll, from the Horus scroll, the 5 feet that we have today. And he tries to argue that by saying, guess what? Verse 12 was actually added in later. Dan Vogel will say it was actually always there. The important part was that it said, I will refer you to the representation. That was always there. And that is good enough to say Joseph Smith was translating with the Horus scroll. Okay, sorry, I don't know. Did that make sense? That's pretty complicated. I feel like you'd have to see the pictures to kind of understand what I'm talking about here.
Yeah,
I think
it's confusing.
You kind of laid out, there's the timeline of when the GEL was created and when the translation process took place, and we know that it took place in November according to Joseph Smith. And what you were saying with the GEL is that they obviously, I mean, the scholars for the church are dismissing it, saying it's nonsense, that it couldn't have followed it.
Right, scholars and
Smith,
LDS and non-LDS scholars agree that is nonsense. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah. LDS scholars think it's nonsense. That's what you said.
Both scholars, LDS and non-LDS, agree that the GEL is nonsense. It's not a translation.
Yeah.
Or at least it's not correct.
So last time Alejandro was talking about that conference he went to where they talked about GEL and how Joseph Smith decided not to use the GEL. Do you remember what he was talking about then?
Okay, great question. So I think this will help. Sorry, before I answer that question, Andre, is there something I can say to make that less confusing?
Probably. I think, let's see here. Well, I don't know, because it is really confusing. Like for me personally, like to understand, I can't see the GEL, so that's probably the hardest part.
Okay. So yeah.
To describe, describing the GEL is a little bit interesting. I probably have to see it.
Let me try this, because you can look it up. If you just Google it, I think Joseph Smith Papers has the original document. Like like what you're talking about, if you're trying to reverse engineer Spanish, you're going to write a character down, and then you're going to write an explanation for it, what it means in English, right?
Right.
So that's kind of the GEL document we're talking about. It's like a side-by-side translation.
I think the part that is going to be hard. You're not going to talk about the dichotomy, are you?
What is that?
The didograph or whatever that they said.
Yeah, I was planning on avoiding that. Okay, so dittography is where if you're copying down something, what happens is, like, all of us do this, right? We are trying to copy a text, and so when our eyes catch a word, we accidentally go to either a sentence above or a sentence below, and we recopy, let's say, or we skip something. Does that make sense? That's a dittography. So what happens is the apologists, Gee and Muhlestein, will try to argue. Dittography. Let's hold that for 1 second. I have to describe these documents for this kind of to make sense. Okay. So I'm actually going to go back to Justin's question first.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So besides all the scrolls, okay, we need to think, what documents did Joseph Smith produce? Okay, so there is something called the Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language, GEL. Okay, that is the side-by-side translation that turns out to be nonsense. The second source that we have to look at are the manuscripts. So this is basically Joseph Smith saying, he's dictating, which means he's reading out loud the translation that he presents of the Book of Abraham, the one that you flip open in your quad today. He's reading this out to two scribes, Parrish and Warren Parrish and William W. Phelps, and they're copying it down. Okay. Those are called the manuscripts. We get all of these from the church archives. They were always with the church archives, by the way. So that's kind of something troubling, but we'll avoid that for now. So the point of the dautography is that the only reason why you bring up dautography in this argument is because you're John Gee or Muhlestein, and you're trying to argue that the Gale came after the dictation of the manuscript, or the Gale came after the book.
Yeah, you're trying to put your manuscripts at a further date.
Yes.
Right? You're trying to date them for a year, greater than 1835.
You're trying to put the Gale at a further date specifically. That's what you have to do to reverse engineer.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. If you're reverse engineering, something has to be in existence already before you can reverse engineer it. So they have to put the Gale at a later date. So here's the thing with the dautography. Okay. This is really into the weeds now. If you guys are still listening, just hang on with me. Okay?
So pretext, you're explaining a document. You everyone sees this document, and it has it's a manuscript. It looks like it's a written, it's a manuscript of the Book of Abraham, and it has characters and things like that are going on, right? And so you're trying to.
So no. The Gale is different than the manuscripts. The Gale is a collection, is several sheets of paper with the side-by-side translation. The manuscripts are two separate scribes writing down the dictation of the Book of Abraham that we have today in our Pearl Grid Price.
Okay, so which one are you trying? You're trying to set the Gale at a further date than the manuscript. If you're an apologist, then you want it to fit your narrative. You want to put the Gale at a further time than the manuscript.
Yes, and so basically, yes. So the apologists are saying, hey, what the apologists are trying to argue actually is that the simultaneous dictation, the two manuscripts by Parrish and Phelps, those were not dictated to them. They're trying to argue that Joseph Smith presented the Book of Abraham at some earlier date, let's say July. He finished it in July, let's say. And then Phelps and Parrish are copying the original manuscript, which we have no evidence that there is such a thing, but they're copying the original manuscript of the Book of Abraham. And that's why there is a dautography, because they're using their eyes, not their ears, to copy. Does that make sense?
Right.
So it's not important for the apologists to argue that the simultaneously dictated manuscripts are placed at a later date necessarily. What they're trying to do is predate an original manuscript to July and post-date the Gale after July so that it's reverse engineering the original manuscript. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good. So basically how I've presented it here, to sum it up, what the evidence shows is that Joseph Smith only translated 3 verses in July. Joseph Smith dictated the Gale to his scribes between July and November. And then Joseph Smith translated the rest of the Book of Abraham by dictating to 2 scribes simultaneously the rest of chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. What the apologists would like to say to support the reverse engineering theory is that Joseph Smith translated the entire Book of Abraham, or at least chapters 1 and 2, in July. And then Gale was produced after July. And then in November, William W. Phelps and Warren Parrish were charged with copying the original manuscript by hand in order to have 2 copies. Okay. Is that more clear?
Uh-huh.
Okay, perfect. So
then I think it's your job to present the evidence to the contrary that Vogel talks about.
Okay, great. Right. So the evidence that so basically what this relies on is whether or not William W. Phelps and Warren Parrish simultaneously dictated those 2 manuscript copies, or whether or not they were copying it by hand from an original manuscript that Joseph Smith had already translated the Book of Abraham, right? So back to what Brian Hauglid said to pretext this, he says, I agree that 2 of the Abraham manuscripts were simultaneously dictated. That's what he's talking about here. So the argument, the reason why he would side with Dan Vogel on this is simply because if you watch the Dan Vogel videos, it seems to strongly side with the simultaneous dictation theory. And so here's the problem to the theory is the dautography, what you mentioned. So dautographies are interesting because they only usually occur if you're copying things by eye. Okay, so there's two datagraphies that he mentioned in his video that Guy presents. Here's the reasons why I think we can dismiss these two datagraphies. The first datagraphy is only a couple words long, and it's when I think Parrish is turning the page. Okay, so if you're dictating, and then let's pretend that he's dictating it. So he's listening to Joseph Smith read the translation, and he's writing the translation down. And then he has to flip the page over. What are the chances that he rewrites two words? That actually seems, maybe likely. I don't see that first datagraphy as a super strong point to totally debunk, okay, it was simultaneously dictated. Okay, because there's actually a lot of evidence for the simultaneous dictation. This is the only evidence against, let's say. The second datagraphy is much more concerning. It's an entire paragraph being recopied, one right under the other, right? So the problem with this, okay, here's the weakness of using this datagraphy as evidence for John Guy's argument that they were not simultaneously dictated manuscripts. It is that this occurs at the very end of Warren Parrish's manuscript dictation. In other words, at the end of his translation, this is where it takes place. So if it took place in the middle, that's a little more sketchy, but this is taking place at the very end. So first data point. The theory Dan Vogel presents is that there are clues in it based on how it's spaced and how it's left margined, how it moves around the page. So you can look at the pictures if you want, because this isn't going to make any sense unless you look at the handwriting. Okay, so I'm going to try to do my best to describe this in words to the best of ability that I even understand this issue. But what seems likely, or at least possible, is that Warren Parrish had to get up and go. Let's say he went to the bathroom, okay? He stopped dictating after that first paragraph at the very end, okay? And then Warren Parrish stayed behind and continued dictating what Joseph Smith said. And then what happens is William W. Phelps comes back, and he's worried that he didn't catch everything that Joseph Smith said, because Warren Parrish captured more than just that one paragraph. And I know I said that this came at the end, so now I'm like contradicting myself. But I think this was at the end of the page is what he meant. So William W. Phelps goes back and copies what Warren Parrish wrote, because he wrote a lot of stuff. But he accidentally copies what Warren Parrish was writing from Joseph Smith's dictation, or that Warren Parrish copied William W. Phelps. So I'm getting really blurry in the details here. You have to watch the Dan Vogel video if you want the hard facts. But here is what I'll say is the evidence for William W. Phelps datagraphized was that he was indeed copying a text, but he was not copying the original manuscript that we have no evidence for exists. He was copying Warren Parrish's manuscript. And the reason for this is because the first line of the paragraph that he copies actually appears in another paragraph at the top of that page, towards the top of the page. So that is where you could have a datagraphy, is because it's not just that he was copying that first paragraph. There's a repeat of the first sentence of the first paragraph earlier on the page. I don't know if that made any sense. Sorry.
I'm with you still.
Okay. So basically, to me, Dan Vogel kind of argues against the datagraphy argument. And that is really like the strongest argument that John Gee can make to debunk his simultaneous dictation theory. And really, the strength of the simultaneous dictation theory comes when you look on the Joseph Smith Papers website. You can look at the two dictations, one by Phelps and one by Parrish, and you'll see them write stuff, and then they'll cross it out, and then they'll keep writing.
So my question is, why would you have two people dictating at the same time?
Oh, that is a great question. Why you would have two? It's probably, I'm speculating here, but if you're gonna create a new text, you're gonna want copies of it, right? It's better to have more than one copy. I don't know if there's any like precedent for that though, that Joseph Smith ever used two scribes at the same time before that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know if he did that before either. I haven't actually looked into it. So
yeah, I think that's a good question, and that is definitely an open question to explore. But if I had to guess, I would say he wants two copies of the thing. Yeah, I mean, but that's what the apologist is going to argue is like, why would he want 2 copies? He would just do 1 copy and then someone else would copy from the copy, right? So once again, the only problem I see with that is if you look at the actual 2 manuscripts, you see them both writing the same thing, and then they'll cross out something, right? And then because Joseph Smith changes his mind, he's like, no, that's not right, right? So they'll cross it out, and then they'll keep writing, right? If you're copying someone else's copy, why would you copy down the words they crossed out and then just to cross them out? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that makes no sense. Yeah, that makes no sense.
Yeah. So there's the kind of reason why Hauglid changed his mind.
Well, unless you want an actual copy, like a real copy of what it was.
Of just for like historical preservation, I guess. That definitely has probably never happened in church history, as far as I know. I mean, today when we're looking back at these ancient documents by Joseph Smith scribes, yeah, we're going to keep the scribbled out parts, but to them, I don't see any value why they would keep scribbled out parts. So right. Yeah, so we're just going to go with that. You know, if you want to argue, if you want to look more into the arguments, there's arguments about the punctuation being signs of, hey, they weren't doing simultaneous dictation. You can explore that, you know, dive as deep as you want. I think we're going to stop the Gale argument at this point and just sum it up. The Gale shows the translation is nonsense. The only way you can recuperate that is to blame it on the scribes and say that it came after the translation. I think that's a weak argument because the evidence, the positive evidence for that is something like dictography, and it's really not that strong. The positive evidence for everything, the complete opposite, is actually that we have the 2 manuscripts. It looks like they're being dictated. And so it looks like they came after the fact that the Gale was written. Now, Justin's question, this is, okay, going back to Justin's question, what in the world does this even mean though? Like, but the fact that the Gale has incorrect translation, we do not have any positive or conclusive evidence that we can say Joseph Smith used the Gale to translate the Book of Abraham. That is correct. Okay. So for example, what that means is people hypothesize and they try to say, well, first of all, Joseph Smith wrote nonsense in the Gale. And second of all, he's using it as a dictionary reference. So he goes back to the papyri and he's like, okay, what does this character mean? And he translates it with the Gale. And then he goes to the next character and he refers back to the dictionary and he translates it. It's almost certain that Joseph Smith actually did not do that. And the reason why is, first of all,
because of the fluidity of the text.
Perfect. Yes. So if you read, like, once again, you have to open up the Pearl of Great Price. The only verse that is choppy is actually verse 3. If you look at verse 3, it does look like he used the Gale on that, right? Because it says, it's like he keeps defining the words in verse 3 of chapter 1. Other than that, it's so fluid, and we have no evidence that he's referring back to the Gale. So that's something to consider when we talk about the catalyst theory later on, and we'll explain that. The other thing to consider is that Dan Vogel goes into a great section though, describing how then why in the world did Joseph Smith even make the Gale in the first place, right? If we are to believe that he was the one who made it. Well, this is how revelation works. It's not, and this is where I find beauty in messiness.
Study it out in your mind.
You have to study out in your mind. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. Joseph Smith is what I believe to be sincerely trying to piece together the Egyptian characters, even though it turns out to be incorrect translation. But he is actually writing down he's brainstorming. He's coming up with the ideas of the premortal life, of the council of gods and the premortal existence, of the astronomy, of the cosmos and Mormon cosmology. All these ideas can't just, he's not working in a vacuum. And that is where I find we can take valuable lessons from
Yes.
this.
Can I add to this? I think this is so important to think about, that, we can't just expect to just receive the ministry of angels at any blank time. You look back on the text that Joseph Smith has before, you look on the word of wisdom, right? It was definitely situational. You have the context, right? And I would take a look at Revelations in context. It's kind of just a really good book to study out. I think you find so much more meaning in the revelations that he received because they're actually what's going on. You're studying it on your mind, you're living these experiences, and you're receiving revelation accordingly. So I think there's a lot of value in that.
Okay, cool. So that is basically the arguments for the Longswell theory. We're gonna go on to the next theory, and this is just gonna be a quick one. The next one is the ideas promoted by Hugh Nibley and Paul Gregerson. Paul Gregerson has a bunch of YouTube videos that I admit I did not watch. Hugh Nibley has a lot of writings older, before all the modern apologetics. And their core argument is that the Egyptologists are wrong in their translation, in that there is a secret code. And the way the Egyptians talked in the past was through this code language. And that's kind of where I might be getting this wrong, but how I understood their theory is basically there's a secret code. Joseph Smith was able to crack it. The paragraph to one character, that all makes sense because that's how they understood it in ancient Egypt. The main problem with this theory I see is that, like, even the LDS Egyptologists don't agree with this, right? John Gee is not going around saying there's a secret code hidden and only Joseph Smith knew it. He's admitting that the Gale is an incorrect translation. So if you want to take Nibley,
and we want to be genuine. We want to be really genuine to Hugh Nibley, right? We talked a little bit before about Hugh Nibley. This is his life's work. He's looked a lot into the historicity of the traditions around Mesoamerica, around Egypt, and things like that. And he found a lot of correlations, a lot of relationship with the Book of Abraham, with the traditions, and he has a lot of supporting evidence there. He talks a little bit about how, I really think he brings up some good points. People ask him. One person asked him if this facsimile 1 has anything to do with Abraham. And he goes, it very well could have something to do with Abraham. Not all of the facsimile 1. There's a lot of different kinds. It's the one where he's on the lion's bed, I think is what it's called, and it's Abraham being sacrificed. And so he says, this image has been seen in other burial sites as well, but we can't assume that every one of these images is supposed to be displaying the same thing. Is his assumption. And so, it's something interesting to point out. He's got a lot of, obviously, books written on this kind of stuff. So I think it's really important to be genuine to his work.
Yeah. So on Hugh Nibley, right? I don't want to dismiss him, I guess, as a scholar, because a lot of LDS people will point to, unfortunately, some. Greg Prince put it this way. He said some people had a testimony of Hugh Nibley. But I don't want to demean Nibley, I guess, as a scholar necessarily, because he did put so many years into studying the Book of Abraham. And in fact, his last book that he wrote, One Eternal Round, he didn't actually finish writing it. Michael Rhodes finished it. But he spent like decades, like 15 years or something, writing that stuff. And so he deeply cared about
and even Michael Rhodes spent, I think it was over 5 years of his life dedicating to putting that book together. And so it's
book. I just compiling what Nibley had to say was a journey for Michael Rhodes. So like, I get there's a lot of, maybe some people are really passionate about this too. And I guess my intention is not to be antagonistic, I guess. But I just personally, I cannot take these theories of the code theory seriously because I don't see that there's any solid evidence for it. It seems more like something you have to do in order to dismiss all of the work and still hold to a literal translation of the Book of Abraham. That's how I see it.
But mostly, and to be genuine, right? To be genuine, you have to say, and I think we both have to say that we've just both looked a little bit more at Dan Vogel's work than at Hugh Nibley's work, right?
Yeah. And I don't claim to be an expert on any of this. Like Nibley definitely knows more than me. Dan Vogel knows more than me. There's probably people listening to this that know more than me, but I also don't, I guess on the other hand, I don't want it to be that you have to be an Egyptologist to come up with a conclusion on the validity of the Book of Abraham. That's kind of my opinion, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think hearing all these things, for a normal listener, it would just seem like there's a lot of gymnastics with your mind that you have to do to justify some of the worldviews.
Right.
And it's
And
not
that's the last
it's
thing you
not
want
to
to do. You don't
dismiss
want.
it's not to dismiss it. And I kind of feel that like I know barely anything about a lot of these things. So, and I think the main thing is, and the CES letter is trying to hit on that, is that there seems to be some issues. There are some issues with the
Right. I think
translation process.
even Nibley himself says that that the Egyptologists or the critics, they've seen that the members of the church have stood silent, and they've taken this as like a sign that they've won or something. And I think it's important as members of the church. Hugh Nibley talks about how we should all receive an education on these kinds of things, and I think that's important to really familiarize ourselves with, learn as much as we can, right?
Yeah, I agree, Andre, and that's why I wouldn't speak certainly on either of these topics because I don't feel comfortable doing that. But I think back to the original point of why we're kind of touching on these issues is to familiarize ourselves with the most simple and basic arguments. Or so I don't feel certain about anything for this topic anyways, because as you'd mentioned, Andre, there's a lot of literature that Hugh Nibley's written and these other scholars. I think getting back to kind of the spirit of this discussion, though, I mean, I think Brandon presented the arguments really well, but there's a lot of minutiae detail that kind of go over people's heads or people really don't care about. So I think the spirit of the discussion is, what are these main arguments that are causing faith crises? Why are they causing faith crises? And kind of our own personal reactions to that.
And I pull my body